Students, so we're back again, Friday's class, and we're continuing on with the principles that underpin an effective training program. So what we're doing today is we're continuing on through the textbook. For your reference, we're on page 292, and we're going to take it all the way through to the about halfway through page 298. So I've already done some summarizing, I've done some photoshopping of some graphs that we need to talk through, and I've got my notes here. So today we're actually going to go through progression. We're going to move into specificity. In progression, we'll talk about progressive overload, which is critical, and then we'll talk about individuality of training programs and variety. That's going to really bring us to the point where 3/4 of that list of the training principle underpinnings are all pretty confident in our knowledge base is where I'm seeing the class. I'm going to give you a task when we complete these notes, and I'm hopefully going to start seeing that you've got a real understanding in your own training regimes of how to see and utilize some of these ideas. Now, we might not be specific enough with our words of training methods, etc. at this current point, because that's a bulk of what's coming next week. But in terms of the understanding of what does specificity, what does progression, what does individuality look like, you guys should get a pretty good base of knowledge. So let's start off with progression. Now, progression is something that we want, because if an athlete is progressing, that means that they're improving. And we keep using this word chronic, long-term, adaptation changes. We want the long-term changes. We want the muscles to become bigger, to become stronger. We want them to become faster. We want them to become more flexible, depending on what the needs are for that athlete and that sport and that position within their sport, because that could change. So what we need to understand is that in order to get progression, we need to put the individual under stress. And so we need to put them in unfamiliar situations. If an athlete is comfortable with completing 10 box jumps on a 20-inch box, they complete those 10 box jumps, they can do that easily. They're not under stress. That means that the next day, their body hasn't gone through any sort of stress or need. We're not going to get any chronic adaptations. So we either need to increase the number of box jumps so that we can put the muscular endurance to test, or we need to increase the height of that box jump from 20-inch to 24-inch so that we're actually working on explosive muscular power, depending on what the needs are for the individual, for the sport, etc. So we need to put athletes in unfamiliar situations during their training. This will promote change. What we need to, though, understand is while we're going through this stress during training, performance of the athlete will decrease. So if we're to put an athlete into a training program, they're deep into week 3 of a 6-week program, and we ask them to go out and compete in their sport that weekend, they're not going to perform at their best. We spoke last lesson about peaking and tapering. And while an athlete is undergoing the stress of progression of training, their performance will decrease. It's because their body is fatigued, their muscles are breaking down so that the adaptations can take place. How do we know when to actually increase the stress for an athlete? It's when the adaptations and the stress on the body starts to plateau, which means flatten out. So we refer to this process as progressive overload. Progressive meaning staged, overload meaning make it harder. And there's a couple of very important rules here. The first one is that we change one variable at a time. So we either change sets or reps or rest or resistance. Whatever it might be, we change one thing at a time. If we change multiple, we are risking overloading too much and causing overtraining or injuries to the athlete. How much do we overload by? The rule is generally between 2% and 10%. I know that's a big range, but anything lower than 2% is proven to show not enough change for the athlete, and anything above 10% is proven to show a high risk category for injuries, etc. So we make the change when the athlete is comfortable with their current load and they need to go under stress again. Generally speaking, we can look at this as a 4-week block, and there's a couple of models. So we have a look at this first graph here. All 3 of these athletes have the same performance level at the beginning. This athlete through here is training with too little or too easy of an overload. So their performance only dips a little bit because they're not under a huge amount of stress, but you can see at the end of the day, they actually don't get much output increase compared to where they were at the start. This athlete under here was put under way too much stress. They got increased the number of sets, reps, and resistance all at the same time. So initially, their performance was lower, they were fatigued, and at the end of the day, they weren't able to train as much and as hard, and they actually have gone less performance due to injury, illness, etc. Whereas this athlete here had the perfect amount of adaptation and overload because they had the decrease of performance during the initial phase of just increasing resistance. And then when they tapered off, their peaking showed that they had great adaptation, maximum adaptation, because they had just the right amount of change. If we're looking at this overload model, this is a 4-week cycled model, but it's within a 16-week training program. So currently, this is the training load that the athlete is completing during week 1. And then in week 2, we increase their training load. In week 3, we increase their training load. And then we back it off in week 4 to give their body time to actually adapt to the overloads and stresses that we've put their body through. Then we increase, 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 and back it off. Increase, 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 and back it off. And we can see that their comfort levels should end up increasing the duration of their training load after the 16 weeks. That means that they're comfortably performing up here in comparison to where they were at the start. But this is a staggered and staged process, which is actually done 1, 2, 3, 4 overloads on a 3-week overload with a 1-week rest. These are micro cycles within one big training program, and it's one way to look at progressive overload. Now I'm going to show you this diagram, and I'm actually going to ask the question that the textbook asks. And I'll get you to think about it, and we can talk about it on Zoom later on. This is the model like I just showed you above. We overload each week, and then we back off in the final week of a 6-week training program. Whereas this one here shows overload after week 1 and plateauing out to let the athlete recover for essentially a 2-week phase, then overloading and plateauing, and then backing it off. And so the question is, which of these models has the greater potential to cause overtraining? But at the same time, which of the models has the greater potential of causing the best adaptations? I'll leave that question to you to think about for later on. Now I'm going to move on from progressive overload and progression to specificity. And specificity is about being specific. So we're talking about here tailoring or making specific a program to the trainer's needs. So we look at an athlete, and we've already discussed this, but just to be specific, the athlete themselves, what are their strengths and weaknesses? The sport in which they're playing, but in particular the position that they play within their sport. We link that to the data collected and the activity analysis taking place. And then we look at the energy systems, the work to rest ratio, the fitness components, and the muscles that are being used to tailor a program specific to that athlete and that athlete's needs. We need to make sure that we look at what muscle groups are being used for the most part. Is it upper body? Is it lower body? And we need to make sure that the program targets the muscles that are being used. So we need to be specific in muscle groupings as well and muscle movements. But we can't forget about the stabilizers. In Year 11 PE, we talked about synergist and stabilizer. The synergist is that main moving muscle. The stabilizer, if we don't have these other group of muscles nice and strong, then the synergist can't do their job properly. So for example, we look at something like the blocking shot during volleyball. We know that we're using our legs to explode up and block the ball as it comes over the net. But if we don't have a nice, tight, strong core to be able to stay as upright as possible during that jump, then our block is not as effective. So while the legs become the synergist muscles that we need to work on, we need to make sure that we maintain the ability of our core muscles to be able to produce a certain amount of force so that the legs can do their job effectively in that jumping motion. So we look at both the synergist and the stabilizers when we create the training program. A lot of people are starting to look at training programs in a more blended fashion these days. So we're looking at incorporating skills training in with the physiological training or physical training. So we're not just going for a run and then stopping and then doing some handball work for an AFL player. We're doing some handballs while running. So we're trying to simulate more like a game style of training, especially in team sports, where we have to blend the skills-based training and the fitness components that are more health-related training. We move on now and we start looking at individuality. Now, it's different to specificity, where we're being specific to an athlete and their sport and their position and their needs. And now what we're looking at is the actual person who you are writing a training program for. Some people are genetically disposed to having more fast twitch muscle fibers. So if we give them a training program that is asking for anaerobic items like muscular power or anaerobic capacity, we're actually going to notice quite a quick improvement and maybe a large improvement in comparison to an athlete who is predisposed to actually having a lot of slow twitch muscle fibers in their body. So those sorts of things we can take into consideration after already giving a training program to an athlete and looking at what their results were from that program. So we need to adapt our training based on what that athlete is also going to be good at and going to get increase in their gains from. And if that means adjusting the position they play in their sport because we know that we're going to get greater improvements from completing this style of training, then maybe that's something that a coach and a team looks into. We need to look at an athlete's preparedness. Now, what that can actually come down to, and the textbook example is great, is an athlete might have been training at a specific level. The number of sets, reps, rest, and resistance that they were training with, the duration of their runs, etc., that they were training before an injury. They might want to go straight back to that style of training and amount of training when they come back from injury, but they're not prepared enough to do that. We need to ease into it. So we need to also make sure that athletes have their preparedness ready with their base level of fitness and health to be able to complete the sessions that we've given them. When we say the word adaptive response, we're referring to individualized people and how they react to training again, similar to the fast twitch, slow twitch of genetic predisposition. But we're talking about the hormones, we're talking about enzymes, we're talking about the genetic makeup of that individual as well, and their motivation levels. So we are actually going to see some athletes will get really quick, big and good adaptations, and other athletes will get smaller adaptations from a training program just based on their genetic makeup as well. When we look at the needs of an individual in a team-based sport, it's quite difficult. Quite a lot of the time nowadays, you'll see forwards, mids, backs all training separately with different coaches because the needs are different. But even within that, you'll have different strengths and weaknesses of different individuals. So when we create a training program for an individual, we can't just create a program for the midfielders. It needs to be the midfielders and this particular athlete and what they need to work on and what their strengths are, what their genetic predispositions are, what their adaptive response and preparedness is. The final thing that we talk about here, and I'll show you the graph, is the diminishing returns properties. When we have an untrained performer, someone who hasn't done much of a training program before, they actually have a high improvement potential. So when we give somebody who hasn't been through any training program before a program to stick to, and they actually stick to it, we actually see quite a huge amount of results come out quite quickly. However, when we look at a highly trained performer who's done many training programs in the past, the amount of improvement that we'll see from them is quite small. This is called diminishing returns, and it's the more highly trained you are, the less amount of improvement we will see when we test that person at the end of the day or look at them with their data in their game. The final thing, and it's a pretty simple, very easy thing to talk about, is variety. And I know I mentioned it in class last week in person before we went to remote learning. And that is that we need to avoid boredom of athletes. So if an athlete is simply training their aerobic energy system, their aerobic capacity, etc., and their aerobic output, because they are a runner, Simply getting them to run every day and have a couple of rest days is boring. We need to give them variety. And so part of the way that we give them variety is by giving them different challenges, different venues, different styles of aerobic training. We might actually have a runner perform a swim one day, or go for a cycle one day, or do some hill running one day, or do a fartlek training session. We need to give them something different that allows them to be excited, lose that boredom, keep that motivation, and keep training at a high output. Because we know that if we can put the body under stress, we're going to get the adaptations and results that we want. We need to keep in mind and focused on, though, the needs of the individual when we keep variety in play here. So we can't just give them a rowing session or an upper body weight session or a flexibility session if it doesn't relate to the energy system, the fitness component, the muscles that they require for their sport. So variety is something that we try and blend into training to make it exciting, to make it continue on for all athletes. Join the Zoom, we'll have a little bit of a chat, and we've got a task that's going to take us further and some questions to answer.